all three of you have testified about many of the problems with economic opportunity in this country, including problems that we're seeing with labor force participation, with declining economic dynamism, and a whole host of other issues on the business side. But what I'd like to get at here is one of the problems that I think underlies a lot of the challenges that we face today. And I'd like to hear from each of you about your brief responses to some of these questions. What are you seeing at the family level? Are there strong families in these communities where these problems are most pronounced? Often we see that success at a local level is built on strong families, is built on strong institutions of civil society, community institutions of one sort or another. But many of these areas have faced declines in recent years. For instance, Stanford economist Raj Chetty and others along with him have identified that in many communities, you've got higher percentages of single parents being associated with lower overall economic mobility. Meanwhile, children with married parents are experiencing a greater degree of upward economic mobility, especially in those communities with fewer single parents. I guess what I'm getting at are these communities simply economically distressed, or is there something deeper going on here? Is there something occurring at a more fundamental level that we need to have a look at? I'd like each of you to respond to this one.
Yeah, thanks, Senator Lee. I think that's a valid point. I think when we look back at U.S. history, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I know we've had social policies that are often well-intentioned to support, for example, single mothers, but not support them if they're married, right? So I don't know the state of that policy now, but I think looking back on it, and this goes back to Senator Moynihan, some of the research that he did, shows that those can be destructive. So sometimes we have well-intentioned policies, and while I wouldn't want to belabor the debate that Jared and I have had many times, friendly debate, I think some of these well-intentioned policies can be harmful. And so you'd want to tread very carefully in trying to fix things. For example, if you have welfare payments or disability payments or unemployment insurance payments in an area that's distressed, that says they can't get those payments if they actually are mobile and move to an area where there's work. So that does merit deeper scrutiny.
Thank you. Mr. Lettieri.
Thank you, Senator. I think we make a mistake when we try to separate economy and culture and institutions. Those are all really deeply linked. And so in a state like yours, you mentioned Raj Chetty's research, which I think is very compelling. Utah features really high social capital. And as a result, it helps to offset things that maybe are not exportable to other states. For instance, Utah spends the least per capita on student education, yet has really tremendous outcomes in terms of upward mobility and prosperity at the community level. And so clearly something else is going on there besides just rates of spending and government intervention. But it's also notable for the fact that government tends to really work well in Utah. And I've looked at this quite a bit, and I've been out to Salt Lake City and Provo. It's an amazingly dynamic economy, and one that, given its results, certainly holds lessons, I think, for the rest of the country, and also policy examples that we should study more closely.
Thank you. Dr. Burns?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thank you for raising it. I think Dr. Chetty's work is extremely rigorous in this area. One of the things they find, however, is that the communities with a large share of mother-only families, as you correctly point out, correlate with lower mobility. But you have to be careful not to conflate correlation with causation. They also find that two-parent families in those neighborhoods experience the same lower mobility rates, suggesting single parenthood is probably more of a correlate than a cause. So I think the thing that I tried to articulate in my testimony that I commend to you is a set of investments in families like this that have a proved track record in improving employment, earnings, health status, nutrition. That has to do with things like the Earned Income Credit, the Child Tax Credit, nutritional support, housing support. We now have longitudinal research that tracks this is what Chetty uses as well, that tracks these kids from birth to adulthood. And we find that the kinds of investments that we often think of as the safety net, kind of helping you today and not having much to do with tomorrow, are actually investments in these kids' futures.
Thank you. A lot of issues there, the things that I want to follow up with if we get a chance later. I want to stay on good terms with my chairman here, so I see my time's expired. Thanks to each of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up where we left off earlier when we were speaking. Dr. Bernstein, I'll start with you. I want to talk a little bit more about the role of civil society. Would you say that more dynamic areas are also known for stronger social ties, active communities, and more civic engagement? Do you see that as something that stands out in the data you review?
You know, I'm not familiar with that connection in the data, but it certainly sounds intuitive to me.
And the fact that it sounds intuitive, I think, speaks to the relative isolation that seems to pervade a lot of distressed communities. At least anecdotally, that's what we see, and from what I know of the data, there are data sets to support that. To your knowledge, has the decline in dynamism in much of America gone hand in hand with the decline in social connections at the local level?
I mean, I think that's true. I don't know so much about the dynamism connection, but I'm thinking of the work of Robert Putnam, the guy who's a sociologist, Bowling Alone and all that. And I think that he is documenting precisely the kinds of dynamics you're talking about.
Thank you. Mr. Lettieri, wanted to get back to you. You mentioned some good stats about my state, which I appreciated, and some nice features. We are seeing a different story than people are seeing in other parts of the country. Labor force participation and the employment to population ratio are several points above the national average, far more favorable than what you see in many parts of the country. And the unemployment rate in Utah is consistently, noticeably below the national average. Given your work in understanding the regional variation in economic success, can you describe for us what you think states and regions with similar numbers are doing differently, and what's contributing to their success? And then also tell us, could this have anything to do with what we've been discussing, with strong institutions of civil society, especially with strong families, and high levels of civic engagement?
It's a great question, and you're exactly right. So places like Utah and then other areas where we see the highest rates of labor force participation are also highly dynamic economies. So there's something about a dynamic economy that where they get really high engagement from their human capital, and that's a important and really rich theme that runs throughout those different state and regional examples. They all come with different advantages, they all come with different industry bases, they all come with different demographics, but they all find a way to engage their human capital at really high rates. So I think that's a lesson kind of broadly that we can apply. I think your point about social capital and institutions runs stronger in the other direction than it does as a predicate for dynamism. And by that I mean, I think this gets to Jared's point, in areas where you see really highly concentrated distress and poverty, you also tend to see low social capital, low connectivity among institutions and families and civic organizations and things like that. It's not always sufficient to produce economic dynamism, but it's a headwind for economic growth when you don't have it. And so I think those on the poverty and distress end of the spectrum, those two are much more tightly correlated than on the dynamism side of the spectrum.
It might be sort of a condition precedent for having it, not always a guarantee, but a condition precedent, or at least a benefit if you do have it.
I think that's right.
And sort of those who in the past who concluded that what you needed more than anything was access to a port or access to a river, a highway, or a government program, it's not always the case. Sometimes what people need more than anything is access to other people, access to networks, access to institutions of civil society to which they're connected. Thank you.
Could I add just one tiny little point?
Go right ahead.
I think everything you just said makes a ton of sense to me, but I also think kind of at the root of some of the places we're talking about is the lack of access to a job. There's just not enough employment activity, and I think if you start bottom up with some direct job creation, actually bring jobs to people, my guess, and again, this is nascent sort of embryonic stuff, my guess is that that would help a lot in terms of the dynamics you're concerned about.
Great exchange.